Well, good morning again. Thank you for being here. We're ready to continue on in our look at medieval church history, chapter 19 in your book. I'm calling this the Emergence of the Holy Roman Empire. In Matthew chapter 6, on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus made a statement that many of us, I think, are probably familiar with. He said this: "No one can serve two masters." And then he explains why. For, or because, either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. And then he sums it up by making this grand statement: you cannot serve God and mammon. It's true you can't serve two masters, but then he identifies two masters that really can't be served simultaneously because they tend to be not on the same page, shall we say, and that is God and mammon, or wealth. What we're going to see here during this portion of church history is that the church is becoming more powerful and more wealthy. And as we'll see in this, that puts the church right in the middle of what Jesus was teaching here in the Sermon on the Mount. Can you really serve God, be loyal and faithful to God, while you possess so much wealth and so much power? And these things, obviously, Jesus makes it clear the answer is no. Now, we left off last time, I know this is a little bit of a backtrack, we left off last time talking about the Carolingian dynasty. And the Carolingian dynasty was primarily the Franks, or the French, and there was a season of that, a period of time in the Carolingian dynasty when a group of people, they were called the mayors of the palace. They were not royalty, but they were bureaucrats. We know what that is. And they were ruling because those who were of the royal family were incompetent, and they didn't really know what they were doing, and so these bureaucrats were running everything. And we saw, again, just briefly, Pepin I, who was a smart guy enough to say, you know something, we're not royalty, and so our jobs can be terminated virtually at any time by the royalty. So he passed a law that said that the position of the mayor of the palace would be one of heredity. So in other words, it was going to pass, as far as he was concerned, from family in the family lines. It went from Pepin I to Charles Martel, and then from him to his son Pepin II. We kind of made a little joke. He was known by two names. They called him Pepin the Short, and he didn't like that. He preferred to be called Pepin the Great. So there's a guy who had some issues. But then the fourth one of the Carolingian dynasty was Charlemagne. And Charlemagne was a very important character. He was great. He was also referred to as Charlemagne the Great. And we're not going to go back over him because we talked about him last time, but what we want to see is what happens after Charlemagne. He dies in the year 814, and the person who succeeds him is Louis, or Louis the Pious. He also made a rule which he called that of royal inheritance. Instead of just going from the father to the son, we can only guess why he did this. Was it because he saw that his sons were maybe not as good as he was, not as bright as he was? Maybe he was just trying to be, I don't know. Who knows? Who knows what his motive was? But instead of it going from the father to the eldest son to be next, he passed this royal inheritance law that says it doesn't go to one son, it goes equally to all sons, and he had three. He had three sons. He had one named after him, Louis, or Louis. He had another named after his grandfather, or great-grandfather, Charles. He was basically well, we'll get into that in a moment. So there was Louis, and there was Charles, and then there was another fellow named Lothair. These are his three sons. What happened is that each one of them got a portion of the property, so to speak. Louis got Germany, in other words, more in the north. And Charles got France, or what we would say is France today, and Lothair got Italy. Now, Lothair seems to have, in some ways, have been maybe the brightest of the three, because he was able to, either that or he was just more shrewd. He actually did get the title emperor, but only 1/3 of the land, because all of the realm was divided equally among the three sons. And so he wanted it all. He wanted it all. He had 1/3 of the land. He had the title, and so he began figuring ways to bring his brother's realms under his control. Meanwhile, Louis and Charles, also known as Charles the Bald, just giving you the facts, representing Germany and France, they allied together with each other against their brother Lothair. And they were pretty successful in keeping it all from going to their brother. But the dynasty began to get weaker at this point just because of this infighting. By the year 870, which is again about 30 years after Louis the Pious dies and leaves this mess for his three sons, by 870, they were three separate lands with three separate peoples, and these three lands were Germany and France and Italy. Now, don't think modern day Germany, France, and Italy, but it's just the regions. Germany, in other words, the northern Europe, France, where France is now, and Italy, of course, where Italy is now. But it's not necessarily the same people groups that we would think of today, because these are all three brothers, and others came in. Now, why is any of this important? Because it shows that there was a lot of change happening. You say, what does any of this have to do with the church? Well, let me explain. The breakup, so to speak, of the Carolingian Empire into these three groups, Germany, France, and Italy, led to a further decentralization of government, and this is known to history as feudalism. Feudalism, as it says there, is a political and economic class system. The system establishes three classes under the king or under the emperor. Okay? And the three classes are the lords, the vassals, and the peasants. Now, they're all three below the king. The lords were the landlords, the landowners. That's where we get the word landlord. These were the people who owned land. They were the only people who owned land, and they had all of the land that was privately owned. Of course, the emperor owned a lot for himself. Then there were the vassals. These were sort of middle management. These were the ones who managed and took care of portions of land that were owned by the lords. And then lastly, there were the peasants. These were the working class. They owned nothing, and they served the vassal who served the lord. The vassals also provided military might for the lords in return for protection of the land that they were managing. You can see a little bit about that on the table that's on the next page, sort of the pecking order. However, the church also owned a great deal of land. Now, for those of you who are nodding off and wondering why in the world are we talking about all this politics and all this land, I thought this was about church history. Well, let's not forget, we learned last time in our last session that one of the things that would, depending on how one looks at it, the church was gaining massive, massive plots of land. They were a huge real estate empire. And now we've got this jockeying for other lands politically. The church owned land that had been donated under more than one auspices. Sometimes it was that somebody was donating land just to try to gain favor with the church. Other times it was donated as penance. If I give land to the church, maybe the church will put in a good word for me when I die. You could buy your way into heaven with that, if only it were true, but of course it's not. And this makes the church a landlord. Not only does it own a lot of land, but there's a whole lot of other people who are living on this land who are now beholden to the church. And it forced the church to be divided in its interests. That's why I began with the passage of Scripture that you can't serve two masters. The church is now in the real estate business, owning vast portions of land, having thousands of people and cities and everything else that were looked to the church as the landlord and the landowner. Well, meantime, it's supposedly trying to be the church, being the spiritual leader. So there's a great deal of problem that goes along with this. And of course, what ends up happening? The church ended up neglecting its spiritual duties in favor of the temporal responsibilities associated with owning land. So once again, you cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon. Serving the church was considered a rather prestigious vocation. Wealthy people wanted sometimes their sons, especially sons who were didn't necessarily show brilliance in business or brilliance in much of anything, but they were wealthy and they didn't want their sons to be idle and they didn't want their sons to not have a job. And so rich people would buy positions for their sons. So we'll buy a bishopric for one of my sons here. That'll be prestigious. And they did literally do it by giving money to the church. There was actually been a few different people in church history who were made bishops and even archbishops, and they weren't even priests. It was just something that was purchased for them, and then they had those positions. So the church, in order to gain more land, granted positions of leadership to men, not just for money, but give us more land, give us more land. They were smart in business because they realized money gets spent, land appreciates. Land becomes an asset and a source of power. And this further distracted the church from its spiritual responsibilities, and it further diluted the level of spirituality among the clergy, because now you've got all these people who are not only priests, but even bishops and some even archbishops. They don't have any training, any knowledge whatsoever about spiritual things. But a rich dad wanted his son to have a good position. We'll give the church some money, we'll give the church some land, and you can have people bending down in front of you and kissing your ring. And it's not just about money. It's also about power. You know, some of you, I'm sure, are quite aware, there are people even in our own day. Money, you know, they may have money, but sometimes they don't even have a lot of money, but they want the power. You know, there's people in our government today who the money is not the main draw. It's the power. It's the power. Of course, what follows power? Money. Nowadays, again, when I say nowadays, I don't mean in the 20th century. I mean like very current. We're not going to mention names, but a couple of administrations prior to where we are now, they came into the White House not being terribly wealthy. They're wildly wealthy now. Why? Because they had power, and with power you can get money, and this seems to be a real problem. So whenever there's this ongoing controversy is going on as to who has the greater authority, the church or the state. And it's very interesting. And again, we've talked about this before and we've seen it before, but I just want to remind you again, what happens is the church is saying, well, we have authority over the state because we'll be the ones who decide who can be the emperor, for instance. And then the state says, no, we'll have authority over the church because we'll decide who can be the pope. Now, in the Western church, the Latin church, what we would now think of as the Roman Catholic Church, this tension was very, very strong. In the Eastern church, Constantinople, the eastern wing of the church, what we would now think of as being the Eastern Orthodox churches, it wasn't quite so much. Over there, the emperor really did rule over the patriarch of the church. The patriarch of Constantinople is the same as the Pope of Rome, except for in a different place. And over there, officials in the church served at the pleasure of the emperor. Is that good or is that bad? I think it's not good. There was less push back and forth, you might say, oh, good, there was more peace over there. There wasn't as much controversy. Yeah, but it's because the church had already rolled over. And the government was dictating who would be in charge of the church, which is probably not a good idea. And of course, all of this political maneuvering distracts people from taking care of business. And again, even in our own day, I mean, we are the divided states of America now. Some of you might have noticed that. You know, we can't get two people in America to agree on anything. And if they happen to live anywhere near Washington, D.C., it's guaranteed that they're not going to agree with anything. And so with all of the political maneuvering that we see going on in our day, what is the Congress and what is the government accomplishing? Nothing. They're accomplishing nothing because they're too busy fighting for who's right and who's wrong and power and this and the other thing. Why do I bring that up? To get political? No, just to show you this is what was happening here too. When there's tension between the church and the state. The church was not without positive influence during this downside into feudalism. There's some bright spots. God takes care of that. The feudal lords and vassals warred with one another, leaving the innocent and the poor, as always, in the crossfire. That's not good. On behalf of these victims of feudal war, the church negotiated some important treaties and some important legislation in order to sort of protect the poor, and that we would say was pretty good. And especially they needed to care for the poor, needed to care for the widows and whatever. So that was good, even though it was all the political maneuvering that was making for the poor, the widows, and the orphans because of the wars that were being fought. Wars which, by the way, had nothing to do with God or the gospel. You know how it is. A lot of people today say, you know, all the wars in the world have always been fought over religion. Well, a lot have, but not all. And some of these the church was involved, but the church wasn't the church. They weren't fighting over spiritual issues. The church had deteriorated into something else, and they were fighting over land and over money and over power. And of course, who gets caught in the crossfire of that? The poor, the weak, the vulnerable. The very ones Jesus was being an advocate for when he turned over the money changers' tables in the temple, because the religious people of his day were exploiting the poor, exploiting the vulnerable. Now, as we sort of come to a close on the Carolingian Empire, there were some good things that came out of that. It was somewhat short-lived. It went for generations, but in the timeline of mankind, it wasn't that long. It reached its height under Charlemagne and then disintegrated upon his death, as we saw, to these various different fragmented leaders who were not quite his equal. Charlemagne's empire was grand. It had an impact on religion, on arts, on education, politics, and we see some of those even still, as he was probably one of the first rulers who said, you know, my people need to be educated and need to learn to read, and he cared about things like that. The dissolution of the empire gave the world 3 new empires, smaller, but 3 new places. What were they? Germany, France, and Italy, because before that they were all sort of one. Italy was the weakest of them because the 2 brothers had allied themselves against Lothair, if you remember, Louis and Charles. The Carolingian Empire heightened the controversy over whether the church or the state was its supreme authority. Both were insisting it was them. This controversy is not as widely debated these days. Why? Because we've sorted it out? No, because the church has abdicated its position and its responsibility. Not that the church should be fighting to have civil authority, because that's not what we're called to, but our position of spiritual and moral authority, we've abdicated that. I mean, God never, ever called the state to take care of the poor. That should be done through love, through charity, through giving, administered by the church. Of course, first is family and then the church. But that's been abdicated. Now the church seems to be quite happy to let the government take care of these things. And of course, they do such a grand job, don't they? No, not so much. The state is now supreme, not because the state took what didn't belong to it, I believe, so much as because the church has neglected or abdicated its role in society. Now, there is another revival of the Roman Empire that comes later in the 10th century. The Carolingian Empire was essentially a French empire ruled by the Franks, and then it gave way to be the French, the German, and the Italians. The Germans of those three seem to have the most power and the most brains. And they were the most bent on ruling the world. And I say this with all fun and jest. Some things never change. But the Germans were the stronger ones. And a fellow named, by the way, the Germans, they provided the muscle to Rome, to the church. So Henry the Fowler, he's the Duke of Saxony. He was made ruler over the Germanic tribes in 919. His son Otto the Great took his place. Otto not only led the state affairs, he usurped the leadership of the church as well, and he began saying the appointment of bishops, the appointment of priests, etc., was solely his. Again, I'm telling you, this is the history of the church, is fighting with the state over who has authority. And it always becomes a problem. Otto's military strength, as I said, he was the muscle for Rome, and Rome returned the favor by making Otto the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So this resurgence of this Holy Roman Empire comes. He was crowned in 962. This made the king indebted to the papacy, and the church is like, yes, he has the position of emperor, but guess who gave it to him? We did. Again, the strength militarily and politically was the Germans, but the church, basically through fear, will excommunicate you and you'll be doomed forever. If you do what we say, okay, we'll do it. So there's this static there. This maneuver, whether premeditated on the papacy, which I think it probably was, once again gave it an understood authority over the state. And this scenario just kept playing and replaying and playing and replaying. Meanwhile, the papacy was being poorly run. There's times when the church is strong and the state is weak, and there's times when the church is weak and the state is strong, and now we're entering into a time where the church was pretty weak, but the Germans were very strong. So the Holy Roman Empire has, which was political. That's not the whole, trust me, understand this, the Holy Roman Empire is not a code word for the Roman Catholic Church. It's not the same. The Holy Roman Empire was the political wing. And if you look at maps, old maps, just look them up online, you'll see maps of the Holy Roman Empire. They have vast areas of Europe. And the Germans, believe it or not, a lot of people don't realize this. We think of the papacy, we think of Italians. Listen, the Germans for a couple of hundred years had authority over the papacy. Very strong authority over the papacy. It was so great that in 996, Otto III forced the church to elect his cousin as pope. We're going to talk about this in the next chapter. He became Pope Gregory V. And it wasn't until Pope Innocent III at the turn of the 13th century that the papacy escaped the domination by the Romans. So the Germans were strong, the papacy was weak. This forced the church, they forced the church to elect a cousin to be a pope. It's just a mess. It's a mess because we're forgetting God ordained the church, God ordained the state for two different things. And they are to hold each other accountable. Yes, the state does have authority when the church is doing something illegal, so long as it's a legitimate law that they're breaking. And the church has the responsibility to call the state down when the state is acting immorally. Constant tension, constant tension. Once again, church-state trouble. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next section.